Unfortunately, I don't have any slides to show, but I hope that my presentation will be very interesting for the audience. And therefore, if you want to put questions related to what I wrote in English, I will be very glad. Because of the theme of the conference, it's about religion and politics, and because I have dedicated many years to this. My paper is called Modern Reflections on Christianity and Democracy in Catholic, Protestant and Orthodox contexts, searching for a common European ground. First of all, I would like to show that there are three types of approaches on the relationship between Christianity and democracy. The first, and I like to underline the thinking of Jacques Maritain, Gregory Vlastos, and Georgios Manzaridis in Greece. The first question that emerged when discussing the relationship between Christianity and democracy is related to the degree of compatibility between the two concepts. This issue was intensely discussed during the 20th century within the context of both radical challenging of democracy and the assertion of democracy as the only political regime that can oppose totalitarianism in any of its shapes. This question found many different answers. Such in the book Christianity and Democracy, published in 1941, Jacques Maritain wrote that the first thing to do is to establish the distinction between democracy as a form of government and democracy as a human and political life philosophy. A distinction that relates to the spheres of Caesar and God. Regardless of the meaning in which one sees the term, according to Maritain, Christianity should not be subdued to any kind of political regime, democracy included. In other words, one can be a Christian and still believe in forms of government other than democracy. One can be redeemed irrespective of one's political option, because assuming the Christian identity was possible even in the context of accepting the Roman Empire, or in the case of implicitly accepting slavery and total monarchy in the 17th century. Maritain believes that democracy is not connected in an absolute manner to Christianity, because Christianity must be regarded as a historical energy at work in the world. Christianity can be found in many forms of government, and if it is combined with the opposite of democracy, it means that it denies itself temporarily in order to achieve its true essence. Christians did not contribute to establishing democracy, but when other forces took action to reach this goal, they accepted the form of political regime that resulted from changing social order. Although human rights were first proclaimed by rationalists and not by Christians, they later accepted their importance. Neither the abolition of slavery in the United States nor the instauration of communism in Russia were the results of the actions of Christians. But in both cases, Christians did not rise against the new social order. Accepting Maritain arguments means that Christians can be encountered in any political party, irrespective of the party's orientation, Christian Democrat, liberal, conservative, or even socialist. This view is very close, as the reader will see, to the one considered to be specific to Orthodoxy. There is an opposite view expressed in the same period, one that holds that there is a natural compatibility between Christianity and democracy, a compatibility which cannot exist in the relationship between Christianity and other forms of political regime. In his book, Christian Faith and Democracy, published in 1939, Gregory Vlastos considers that a generalized consensus had been reached in the societies we live in. This consensus concerns some simple truth. Power is for public use, if cannot be exercised as a form of oppressing private life. The government is a public service, and those who govern should serve the public good. Both these are included, according to Vlastos, in the concept of democracy, and can be denied only by returning to the pagan idea that political authority belongs to him who is strong enough to seize it and hold it by brute force. Such, when talking about the relationship between Christianity and democracy, Vlastos states that the Christian tradition is based on every man's dignity. This dignity is viewed, in first place, as a personal choice that allows for the emergence of a political society which originates in a covenant. Vlastos explicitly underscores the strong bond between Christianity and democracy by saying that love and justice are part of the destiny of those who share the Christian faith. Justice means every man's right to be respected as a human being, as a purpose in itself, and not as a means to attaining goals. The supreme form of Christian love is to dedicate one's life to serving the community. Democracy makes sense if it is based on this Christian understanding of the values of love and justice. Undoubtedly, the reflection to the relationship between Christianity and democracy is influenced by confessions. There is a Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox type of reflection. Even the authors who deal with this subject do not take on a religious identity in opposition to others. There are common points for the three approaches, just as there are differences. The latter are not so obvious when it comes to the relationship between Christianity and democracy. They become visible when one examines the issue of the participation of Christians in political life. If one accepts the idea that democracy is the only form of political regime compatible with Christianity, the issue of participating in political life is much simpler, meaning that Christians' association with different political parties can succeed no matter what the political option is. On the other hand, if one believes that Christianity can be associated with any form of political regime, even if this association happens by a temporary denial of the essence of Christianity in order to justify the Christian presence in the world, the issue of Christian participation in political life becomes a different matter. The dilemma of choosing between the solution of Maritain and that of Vlastos was present throughout the entire second half of the 20th century, making possible the emergence of very different options regarding Christian participation in public life, the acceptance of certain political regimes or by denying others, and the acceptance of all political regimes as forms with which Christianity can have a relationship of conflict or perfect harmony. Even though the arguments invoked were not always based on the positions formulated by Maritain and Vlastos, in the end one can conclude that the solutions implemented were based on their two conceptions, or a combination of these, by dealing with the issue on two levels, the transcendent and the worldly, which are usually regarded as having very little in common. Without claiming to accept only the arguments of Maritain or Vlastos, it is useful to pass on to the next question. Can a new reflection that reconciles the two different views be accepted? If the answer is yes, what type of Christian participation in political life is allowed by this third option? Throughout the 20th century, within Orthodoxy, no point of view was articulated regarding democracy, and such the Christian participation in political life was not extensively discussed. The absence of a clear perspective was usually interpreted as being generated by a certain incompatibility between Orthodoxy and democracy. According to this assumption, Orthodoxy is, in comparison with other Christian confessions, the least interested in answering these questions. But the purpose of my intervention is not to analyze whether or not Orthodoxy articulated the belief on its own regarding particular forms of political regime and to what extent this belief could be compatible with others. It is worth mentioning that the approach of Orthodox Christian theologians to this matter represents, in fact, an attempt to overcome the dilemma of taking sides in favor of Maritain and Vlastos, and this was done not by denying their approaches, but by setting the premises differently. Notice the approach to this issue in the Eastern area. In the West, this line of thought originates in the minds of authors who did have Christian affinities, but who did not belong to a particular confession. In the East, the issue is raised within the Orthodoxy and only afterwards by those interested in decoding the virtues of democracy. All of these writers, the authors, I consider Gregory Manțaridis and his Christian morality from 2004 the clear example. Manțaridis considers obedience to be specific to Christianity. He distinguishes between three forms of obedience: towards God, towards one's neighbor, towards the worldly leaders. Of these, only the love of God is absolute and complete, while the other two are partial and relative. Such, decoding the relationship between Christianity and democracy is not a relevant issue, because Christianity is placed on a transcendent level with which the various forms of political regime have nothing in common. This does not mean that Christianity should not pay attention to the political regime that it lives under. It simply means that it is less important than faith. Mantzalidis considers discussing these forms of political regime less important. All these forms proclaim secularized Christian principles. An example of this is the Enlightenment, which promotes liberty and equality without granting them a Christian meaning. Another example is communism, which suggests a type of society that is nothing more or less than a secularized Christian paradise. Mantzalidis tackles more directly the issue of taking part in political life. Despite other Christian-inspired authors who consider political involvement a foregone conclusion, Mantzalidis tries to explain the two aspects of this participation. On the one hand, it's normal for Christians to be interested in political life, which may also entail a lack of participation. Refraining from politics represent a certain form of politics, he wrote, which leads to degradation of political life. There is an interesting approach to this perspective, which explains the attitude of orthodoxy towards the relationship between Christianity and democracy. Democracy is not legitimized by the simple fact that people participate in it. Similarly, abstention does not necessarily signify a questioning of democracy. It rather makes supporters of democracy ask themselves questions about the reasons behind the weak interest in politics. According to Mantzalidis, Christians should not avoid exercising political power because of the risk of it being exercised by those who are not worthwhile. Such, Christians should not be encouraged to avoid politics because, for Mantzalidis, politics is a field, it's an area for expressing one's virtues, and Christians know best how private virtues can be manifested in public life. Still, this does not necessarily give a good Christian a starting advantage over others when it comes to political activity. Succeeding in politics does not depend on a clear understanding of the Christian's role in the world. By distinguishing between laymen and clergymen, Mantzalidis relativizes the virtue of being involved in politics. Consequently, believers can participate in politics without feeling that faith comes second, and the church should not adhere to the principle of any particular political organization. In other words, the distinction between laymen and the clergy within the church is legitimate for Mantzalidis because it describes different attitudes towards politics. It also helps us to understand why the attitude of orthodoxy toward democracy is harder to measure than in the case of other Christian confessions, where these distinctions have no clear-cut boundaries. Involvement in politics and attitudes towards different forms of political regime are not, according to Mantzalidis, issues that should be dealt with by an antithesis or including others, because any form of political regime is ephemeral. All regimes have the obligation to respect the historical collective consciousness of its society, of which the church is the part, and not to take measures against institutions, people, and this collective consciousness. In other words, it is each politician's primary duty to be aware of the intrinsic limit of its possible actions. Otherwise, these actions are no longer legitimate and will be challenged. Because the actions of politicians are conditioned by the fate of other constituents, the question of relationship between Christianity and democracy becomes simple. It is not Christian believers who should question democracy or involvement in political life, but those who exercise power in order for the actions to be accepted and make sense. Why should we discuss the question of the form of political regime, since, according to Mantzalidis, the church transcends all of these forms? For most long-lasting government or political party of all times has an insignificantly shallow past in comparison with the church during its vast history. I discuss also the relationship between Christianity and democracy and the Christian involvement in politics from the Western perspective and from Mantzalidis' perspective, but I would like to step to the conclusions and telling also some recent reflections on the relationship between Christianity and democracy. There are not so many authors nowadays trying to think how Christianity accommodates with democracy. Marko Vekocic, writing in 2021, that he wants to challenge the assumption that Orthodox Christianity is incompatible with democracy, and this is the reason why he is offering an innovative theoretical framework for dealing with the issue of orthodoxy and democracy. Vekovic focused on the political behavior of Orthodox Christian churches in the democratization process from a comparative perspective, and shows that different Orthodox churches acted differently in the democratization processes in Greece, Serbia, and Russia. He's focusing on institutions rather on political theology, and tries to give interpretation from a comparative perspective. By studying the historical, cultural, and political roots, the Orthodox Church in these three countries, Vukovic examines whether the Church plays a significant role in the democratization process, and the answer is positive. In a book published in 2025, Jonathan Rau is asking some issues related to the future role of Christianity in liberal democracy, USA. His main question is what will happen if Christianity will no longer able or no longer willing to perform the functions of which our constitutional order depends. His answer is that the crisis for Christianity has turned out to be a crisis for democracy. And finally, James Paul Lusk, in a book published also in 2025, states that the first modern democracy has been developed by Christians. Nowadays, Christians need a new kind of state to replace the past Christendom. For Lusk, Christendom was a political form where all citizens had to be Christian, and this meant that the state had to define the form of Christianity that qualified for political rights. Democracy is just the logical step forward for Lusk, as Christians want to be free and to break this link between politics and faith. For Lusk, the result was democracy that considered all people equal regardless of faith. And finally, after examining all this view, I have a consistent part about how Stani Loaie, how Father Nicolae Bălan and others wrote about democracy, but maybe it is more interesting from the Romanian authors, or my text is already written. So I would like to share with the conclusions very fast. What is the future of the involvement of Christians in politics, and how will the relationship between Christianity and democracy be regarded in the near future? These are open questions to whom the author, me, will try to sketch an answer. Secularization in Europe led not only to a diminishing role of the church power in society, but also to a delegitimization of the parties that originates in the Christian tradition. Whether secularization is an iron law of contemporary society is not a relevant issue here, since a separate analysis would be required for an answer. However, it can be said without doubt that the survival of these parties in the West is the proof that the effects of secularization have been much less extensive than expected, and that these effects are not irreversible. The fact that religion, at least in its institutionalized form, does not have the same impact upon social and political attitudes that it will be, does not mean that it will not have any impact upon those in the future. One can say that we are currently witnessing a questioning of the capacity of the Christian-inspired democratic model, which is based on a form of social capitalism, to successfully mobilize various social ideas to create a political model that reflects the needs of society. The social capitalist model is the essence of Christian democracy project developed within the nation state, and such has demonstrated the benefits it brought to the West during the period that is coming to an end. What will replace this model and when this will happen are questions that do not have an answer. However, one can say that out of the social capitalist model based on ethical values of Christian morality was practiced in the West and assimilated by the Catholic and Protestant churches, it was not fully taken advantage of within Orthodoxy. This will allow Orthodoxy, in my view, to either pass through an intermediate phase of reflection of its own, or directly formulate a different reference to the European social model. Political parties that accepted the Christian role within democracy and consequently religious role in the public arena will not disappear soon. Christian ethics, the main basis of the action of these parties, has not disappeared. On the contrary, it has also spread beyond the churches, which are regarded as traditional institutions to which religion is disseminated. A notable percentage of supporters of these parties are party secularized, meaning that they do not declare their membership to a particular church. The main challenge for these parties is not related to the increase or decrease of secularization in Europe, but to the crisis of representation, an issue that affects all ideologies. Parties can no longer state clearly whom they represent, and it is obvious that we are witnessing the decline of the 20th century party, whose main function was that of intermediary between state and society. Political parties are no longer a link between state and society. Instead, they have become increasingly dependent on the state resources. Once political parties become aware that moving closer to the state and away from society will lead to their disappearance, they will attempt to find new ways of increasing their social relevance, and the survival chances for a democracy, seen as an aggregate of Christian social views, will increase. Such a perspective has an unexplored potential to explain social reality and transform it to the benefit of the citizens. The only requirement for this is that political active Christians who wish to believe in the virtues of democracy see political action as cooperation among peers and not as an unconditional acceptance of the will of the state, which is embodied in impersonal institutions and not in the consciousness of the people. Thank you.